The change didn't arrive with an explosion. It arrived quietly, through contracts rewritten behind closed doors, shipping lanes rerouted, and alliances shifting in ways most people never see until the world around them becomes unrecognizable. For the first time in nearly 80 years, the foundations of global money are being rewritten not by economists or central bankers, but by geopolitics itself. Here's what nobody tells you. The future of money is no longer a financial story. It's a power story. And in a world divided into rival blocs, every nation is asking a question that affects your savings, your job, and the price of everything you buy. What happens when the currency that built the modern age begins to share the stage with competitors who are no longer willing to play by the old rules? This is where the pattern begins. Money has always followed power, not the other way around. In 1914, the British pound backed more than half of world trade. By 1944, it backed almost nothing. The transformation happened because global power moved, from the exhausted empires of Europe to a rising United States untouched by the destruction of war and holding more than 2/3 of the world's gold. In a single generation, the financial map was rewritten. Nations didn't choose the dollar because they loved it. They chose it because the alternative was irrelevance. And here's why this matters. Every currency that becomes global dies the same way. Not from weakness, but from competition. The shift begins slowly, then suddenly becomes irreversible. Let me show you exactly how. When the Second World War ended, the United States controlled the oil supplies, the trade networks, and the security guarantees needed to keep shipping lanes open. Other nations didn't just use the dollar, it became the bloodstream of global commerce. But a turning point came in 1973, when the petrodollar system was born. This was a geopolitical bargain. U.S. security for the Gulf states in exchange for pricing all oil in dollars. Through this deal, every country that needed energy needed the currency of a single nation. Not gold, not their own balance sheets, dollars. That was the mechanism that locked in American monetary dominance for half a century. But patterns that stabilize the world eventually weaken it. The petrodollar system created the illusion of permanence. At first, it looked like a miracle. Then the bill arrived. Nations sanctioned by the United States began searching for alternatives. Rivals realized that whoever controls energy pricing controls money itself. And as the 21st century unfolded, something unprecedented began happening. Major economies started planning for a world where global trade might not remain unified, and where the reserve currency might not belong to a single country anymore. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. The danger wasn't what nations saw, it was what they ignored. After the 2008 financial crisis, analysts argue that trust in the dollar-based system began to erode. By 2014, Russia and China launched their own payment networks. By 2018, sanctioned countries developed alternative settlement systems designed to bypass Western banks altogether. And after 2022, when nearly half of Russia's foreign reserves were frozen, a message echoed across boardrooms and ministries worldwide. If your political interests diverge from Washington's, your money may no longer be yours. Here's what nobody tells you. Freezing another nation's reserves is more than a financial penalty. It is a rewriting of the rules of global money. It tells rising powers that the system is not neutral. It is strategic. It is political. And that realization has accelerated a shift economists long suspected might emerge. Fragmentation. Not collapse. Not chaos. Fragmentation. Multiple financial spheres competing the way empires once did for trade routes and influence. Not one global currency, but several. Not a single system, but rival networks of settlement, energy pricing, and digital infrastructure. This is where the pattern begins repeating itself. When the pound began its decline, the signals were subtle: trade imbalances, wartime debt, and the rise of new manufacturing powers. Today, analysts suggest something similar could be happening with the dollar's status. Not a fall, but a rebalancing. Not weakness, but multiplication. What makes this moment different is that technology has removed the barriers that once kept alternative currencies from rising. Digital settlement systems don't need the physical infrastructure of the old world. Central bank digital currencies allow nations to conduct trade without touching the traditional banking system. Blockchain-based settlement mechanisms let countries conduct transactions with transparency yet without reliance on any Western institution. And here's the mechanism driving the shift. Geopolitics determines security. Security determines trade. Trade determines currency. The nation that provides the safest shipping lanes attracts the largest flows of goods. The nation that buys the most raw materials influences pricing. And the nation that sets the price becomes the issuer of the currency used to buy it. Not morals, not intentions. Power. At first glance, the world still appears stable. 90% of global trade still touches the dollar in some form. But beneath the surface, the alignment of nations is changing. China is settling more of its trade with Asia, Africa, and the Middle East in yuan. Russia prices energy in rubles or yuan. India purchases oil in non-dollar currencies depending on the seller. And BRICS nations openly discuss, though with uncertainty and competing incentives, the possibility of a shared settlement currency. Some economists argue that while these developments don't dethrone the dollar, they signal the end of its uncontested dominance. The pattern echoes history. Before the pound fell, it remained dominant even as new challengers grew in strength. Before the Dutch guilder collapsed in the 1700s, rival financial centers were already emerging. A reserve currency doesn't lose power when its economy collapses. It loses power when its rivals gain enough strength to offer alternatives. And according to several analysts, that is precisely what may be happening today. Here's why this matters. When the structure of global money changes, ordinary people feel the impact long before economists issue forecasts. Consumers experience it as higher prices. Businesses experience it as supply chain volatility. Governments experience it as rising borrowing costs, and investors experience it as a transformation of the world's safest assets into something more unpredictable. But there's a deeper, quieter force at work, one that will define the next 50 years of economic life. For the first time in modern history, major nations have the incentive, the technology, and the geopolitical motivation to build parallel monetary systems. Digital currencies allow settlement without banks. Energy alliances allow pricing without dollars. Security blocs allow trade without Western approval. The world is no longer asking whether the global currency system will change. The world is asking when, and who will write the next chapter. Yet the most important question remains unanswered. If geopolitics is now rewriting the future of money, what does the final stage of this transformation look like? Will the world shift into competing blocs? Will a new reserve currency rise? Or will money itself become something entirely different, something borderless, digital, and shaped not by nations but by networks? The answer begins with a story few people have heard, and it changes everything. The shift begins not with collapse, but with contradiction. For decades, the world relied on a single financial architecture to move goods, settle debts, and store national wealth. But now, as geopolitical tensions rise and rival power blocs strengthen, analysts argue that the very institutions designed to stabilize the world may be creating the conditions for a new monetary landscape. And here's what nobody tells you. Once the architecture of global money begins to fracture, it never returns to what it was. It evolves, it reorganizes, and it redistributes power in ways nations cannot fully control. This is where the pattern begins again, quietly, inevitably, and with consequences that reach every corner of the global economy. To see where this path leads, let me show you exactly how the mechanism operates. When nations fear that their assets might be frozen, seized, or manipulated for political leverage, they don't protest, they adapt. After 2022, many governments began exploring bilateral trade arrangements that bypass Western financial systems. China expanded its cross-border interbank payment system. Russia deepened its use of alternatives to SWIFT. Middle Eastern energy exporters strengthened ties with Asia. None of these actions, taken individually, threaten the dollar. But analysts suggest that collectively, they represent the early formation of what some call a multipolar settlement ecosystem, where the world's most strategic goods, energy, minerals, food, technology, can flow through channels that no single superpower controls. At first, this looks like diversification. Then the bill arrives. Diversification becomes fragmentation. Fragmentation becomes rivalry. Rivalry becomes the new normal, and in every historical era where payment systems fractured, empires found themselves forced to adapt or fade. That was true for the Dutch in the 1700s. It was true for the British in the 1900s. According to several economists, the question today is not whether the U.S. dollar will vanish, it won't, but whether its monopoly over global settlement will gradually erode as competing systems become more attractive to nations seeking autonomy. Here's the mechanism. Trade determines currency power, but geopolitics determines trade. Nations aligned with rising blocs may seek settlement arrangements that reflect new political realities. This isn't rebellion, it's incentive. If you buy oil from a country sanctioned by the West, you don't want to use a Western bank. If you want to avoid exposure to interest rate shocks, you diversify your reserves. If you distrust global institutions, you build your own. And if you're a rising superpower, you test how far you can extend your influence through the quiet logic of economic gravity. Everyone thought the digital revolution would democratize money. Instead, it gave governments new tools to reshape monetary power. China's digital yuan provides an alternative settlement rail that can move across borders without passing through traditional clearance systems. Several BRICS nations experiment with blockchain-based trade tokens. The European Union debates digital euro frameworks that could secure its financial autonomy. According to some analysts, these developments do not signal the end of traditional currencies but the beginning of a hybrid era, where money becomes part physical, part digital, part geopolitical instrument. At first, these technologies seemed harmless, even promising. Then, the danger revealed itself. Digital settlement removes the frictions that once prevented rapid financial realignments. A nation no longer needs a global banking network to shift the balance of trade. It needs only a functioning digital system and a network of trading partners willing to use it. And here's the trap. Once digital rails exist, the cost of forming alternative monetary blocks falls dramatically. What once took decades can now unfold in years. History warns us that monetary transitions follow a consistent pattern. First comes the rise of a rival economic power. Then comes the creation of parallel financial institutions. Then, trade routes shift. Then, alliances realign. And finally, the currency system changes. Today, analysts argue that these first three stages are already underway. Stage 4 is developing. Stage 5, monetary reorganization, remains uncertain, but no longer unthinkable. One scenario indicates a future where the dollar remains dominant but no longer alone at the top. A blended system emerges. Dollars for global commodities, yuan for Asian trade, rupees or dirhams for regional flows, and digital tokens for high-speed settlement. Under this scenario, the world becomes more complex, but not unstable. Nations hedge their bets. Corporations adapt. Money evolves without breaking. Another scenario suggests a tighter fragmentation. Rival blocs consolidate into competing economic zones. Trade between blocs slows. Supply chains shorten. Currency alliances deepen. Money becomes a geopolitical identity, not a neutral tool. According to some economists, this could lead to a world where inflation, interest rates, and commodity prices diverge dramatically between regions, creating a landscape where financial crises no longer spread globally but erupt locally with unpredictable intensity. A third scenario, one that technologists find most compelling, imagines a future where the reserve currency is not national at all. Instead, it could be a digital asset governed by international protocols and used strictly for settlement, not political leverage. No flags. No military alliances, no sanctions network, just mathematics and liquidity. But here's the trap. Power rarely gives up its tools voluntarily, and money has always been the most powerful tool of all. This is why the world now stands at the edge of monetary transformation. Not collapse, transformation. The question is not which currency will win, but which nation will control the system through which value flows. In this emerging era, networks matter more than notes. Infrastructure matters more than reserves, and alliances determine the future far more than balance sheets. What analysts suggest is emerging is an invisible contest, fought not with armies, but with payment rails, energy contracts, digital currencies, and trade corridors stretching across continents. Here's why this matters. When geopolitics rewrites the rules of money, every household feels the consequence. Savings become more sensitive to global shocks. Food and energy prices swing with geopolitical tides. Debt becomes harder to manage. Investors face a landscape where old assumptions dissolve, and governments must choose whether to cling to the old order or adapt to the new one. The final question remains, the one that will define the century. If money is no longer tied to a single superpower, who or what will define its value in the decades ahead? Will a new reserve emerge from the ambitions of rising nations? Will digital networks dissolve old hierarchies? Or will the world wake up one day to discover that the transformation has already happened, silently, while everyone assumed the old system would last forever? The answer lies in a conflict unfolding behind the scenes, a race between nations to control the next architecture of global finance. And the shocking part is this. The winner may already be building the system that will replace everything we take for granted today.